Yeah, it's been interesting, Chuck. My producer and I, we have driven to 10 different precincts across Miami-Dade County, and we have yet to find a voting precinct with any significant amount of voters waiting in line. This is election day in Florida, but in so many ways it does not feel like election day. Just take a look at what's going on behind me. We have poll workers here fully decked out in PPE, a term that most Americans didn't really know what it meant until a few months ago. They are wearing face shields, they are wearing gloves, they have surgical masks on. Behind them, there are ballot booths, and you can see that voting booths, for the most part, it's not that crowded here. Prior to Election Day, 65% of registered voters in Miami-Dade had already cast their ballots, either absentee or early in person. Today, on Election Day, officials here in Miami-Dade County told me they were expecting to see somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 voters come to the polls today. As of right now, 5 p.m. Eastern time, they say 118,000 people have voted in person in Miami-Dade County. This county is a big county. It is a Democratic stronghold. We do not expect President Trump to win here. Former Vice President Joe Biden will most likely win this county, barring something astronomical. But he doesn't need to just win here. He needs to win here big. Remember, Hillary Clinton won this county in 2016 with 63% of the vote. Florida is all about the margins, and that margin was not big enough for her to carry the state. Chuck.
Ellison Barber in Miami, Florida. Ellison, thanks very much. Let me move over to Chris Jansing. All right, Chris. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? And are we seeing similar things where it's sort of an odd election day?
Say the least, not the least of which is when I talked to a couple voters, I said, you know, how's it going? And they pointed to their mask and said, first time for this. Talk about that in a little bit. But look, the voting has been robust. That's the words of the lieutenant governor, who, as you know, is a Democrat. Folks on the state level I'm talking to say it's big, not Obama big, but big. Long lines at polling places, particularly in areas where there's a heavy concentration of people of color. Few complaints about voting problems, mostly the normal stuff that they're likely to see. But what we are seeing, and I'll just give you Lackawanna as an example, is teams of lawyers, which was to be expected given all the concerns about the vote count here in Pennsylvania. This is a county where in 2016, Chuck, 103 less, a few less than 103,000 people voted. Over at the county offices today, they've had at least 20 lawyers going in and out from the Biden campaign, from the Trump campaign, from the local Democratic committee. And one of the things that they're seeing also is what you know is vote spoiling. Just yesterday, the president was here down the road at the airport, and he basically said to the governor here, you know, watch out. We're going to be watching you. Don't cheat. He's been continuing to talk about these unfounded comments on fraud. A lot of people showing up who had gotten mail-in ballots, including people here who told me after hearing so much about whether or not they'd be legit, whether they'd be counted, they are coming in to vote in person. Another thing that we're watching here. And finally, I'll say about the mask. A headline probably that the president didn't want today that we saw all across this part of northeastern Pennsylvania is that COVID has spiked to the highest numbers since the pandemic began in this region, Chuck.
It is one of those I've often wondered, and we'll find out tomorrow if we'll think this is true, but that the virus spiking in the last week of this campaign is probably the October surprise as far as history books are going to be concerned. Chris Jansing in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Scranton, as we've been saying locally lately. Let me move to Josh Letterman. He's in Lorain, Ohio. And Josh, let's be realistic. 6 months ago, I did not think we were going to be sending any correspondents to Ohio for Election Day coverage. But here we are. And I tell you, I talked to the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, today. He thought it was going to be close. And that says a lot.
Yeah, it sure does. And you heard from Mike DeWine in that interview on MTP Daily about how the early results could potentially look like they favor Biden because it's going to be largely those absentee and mail-in votes. And then later on, they'll start bringing in some of those votes that are actually cast today on Election Day. And I'll tell you, Chuck, we started our day in Lorain, as you mentioned, where there were lines early in the morning as the polls were opening. But then it's been slow and steady during the day. And that's been been the case around a lot of Ohio today, but we actually just came here to Rocky River because we heard that there had been long lines all day long here in Cuyahoga County in the suburbs outside of Cleveland, and that turned out to be true. I'll show you a little bit of what's going on here. You've actually got two lines of people voting. You've got all the people who are waiting in person to go inside, and then you've got these people waiting in their cars to do curbside voting, which is something that they're doing this year because of people not wanting to go inside due to COVID. But, you know, we talk about turnout, Chuck. The name of the game for Joe Biden is turnout here in Cuyahoga County. And so we've been watching because the county actually reports in real time the number of votes that are coming in. In 2016, you had voter turnout here fall off a little bit from the 70% that it had hit in 2012, the second time Barack Obama was on the ballot. So far, they're still in about 64% turnout the last time I checked before we came on air. So Joe Biden really wanting to get that above 70% here, and that's why, of course, the vice president made that late visit to the county just yesterday.
Josh Letterman with some important numbers there in Cuyahoga County all along. If Joe Biden is somehow going to pull this upset in Ohio, he has got to recreate some Democratic margins around those counties that touch Lake Erie. Josh Letterman, thanks very much. Let's go to Morgan Radford. She is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And North Carolina, of course, is one of these states that could be a tipping point state for two things we're watching tonight: the Senate, control of the Senate, as well as the presidency. What are you seeing there? Big early vote state in Charlotte. So what's Election Day look like?
Right now at this hour, just 2.5 hours before these polls close. Number one, we got word from the State Board of Elections earlier this afternoon, and they said that there's going to be a 45-minute delay this evening in terms of when the precincts across the state can actually report their results. So it doesn't mean that the polls are going to be open for an additional 45 minutes, but they do have to wait for a few polls that will, simply because they got a late start, and they have to wait to report those results until the very last precinct closes its doors. And the second thing we're watching, Chuck, is this group of unaffiliated voters. When we're talking to officials from parties across the state, they said they're kind of nervous about which way these unaffiliated voters here in North Carolina will swing. Why? Because since the last election, there's been a surge in newly registered voters. So each party has seen north of 100,000 new registered voters, respectively. But there was a surge of 400,000 registered unaffiliated voters. And Chuck, here in North Carolina, those voters, they typically tend to lean Republican, but this year some state Republican officials have told us they're a little bit nervous because they've seen newer, younger families moving to the area, and they're a little bit nervous that they're going to swing Democrat. Now, as you mentioned, a lot of people are also focused on that very tight Senate race. It's something that the entire state has been watching because that could flip the balance of power, not only in the state, but also throughout the country. So we've been talking to voters here at what is typically one of the busiest precincts in Mecklenburg County, and we've been talking to them about the things they care about. Take a listen. Oh, I don't think you guys have the sound, but Chuck, we were talking. Yeah, I didn't know. Worries, Chuck. Well, listen, I can tell you what they said. We've been here all day. People have been focusing on the pandemic and COVID-19 response. They're concerned about jobs and the economy. We've spoken to several voters and supporters of President Trump, and they said some things they don't like about the way that he tweets, but every single person we've spoken to here who said they are supporting the president again said they are doing so in hopes that the economy will recover. Those Biden supporters we talked to said that they're looking for a moral leader who they feel like can bring the country together. And so we'll see what happens tonight. Again, those polls close at 7:30, but we won't start hearing those actual reports from the precincts until about 8:15, Chuck.
A very important thing. So our new unofficial poll closing time for North Carolina, about 8:15. Anyway, Morgan Radford in Charlotte for us. Morgan, thanks very much. And thanks to all of our reporters out in the field right now. At this moment, we're going to get our first look at tonight's early exit polls. But please remember, this is not a definitive look at tonight's electorate. In fact, it is our first look. These numbers will change as you get, the exit polls do get reweighted. That is okay. That happens. That's not the end of the world. So all of these are with a caveat. Some parts of it. So And this year's exit poll was even harder to conduct than ever before. We're in a pandemic, not as many in-person. You've seen there's very few voters out there today. We went to some early vote, a lot of phone polls. So the point is that these are early exit polls. So I think we've got a few ready to go. And we're going to find out here in a minute what we've got going on here. We'll look at our exit polls. Okay, the one key question, to me, the most important question that is going to be on this poll was when we asked which is more important, containing the virus, coronavirus, or rebuilding the economy. And on the national scale, look at that, 52-42. And I want to tell you, does that number seem familiar if you work here at NBC? Yes, it does, because the final NBC Wall Street Journal poll spread between Joe Biden and Donald Trump was 52-42. But keep that number in mind. So nationally, 52-42, a 10-point gap in favor of containing the virus over the economy. And we've seen that economy voters seem to be Trump voters, virus voters seem to be Biden voters. We don't know that in this exit poll. We can just tell you that from our previous polling. Now let's go through the battleground states. I think we have quite a few of them where we can show you this split on this question. So here you go. Florida looks like the national number, 52-41 there. Now look at Arizona, 8-point spread, again in favor of the virus, 51-43. Let's keep them rolling here. Next one. Iowa voters, a little more narrow. This is an older electorate, 49-45. North Carolina, 51-45, so 6. Not quite that 10-point spread there. You see where I'm going with this? Ohio, look at how narrow this spread is. Economy actually with a 1-point advantage over the coronavirus. So essentially, Ohio split on this question. Texas voters narrowly on the virus question over the economy. And I believe we have Nevada voters coming up here in a minute as well. Here's Pennsylvania voters. You can see there it's a 9-point split, virus versus the economy. And finally, Michigan voters, a 13-point split there of virus to the economy. That's a state that has obviously had more restrictions than some of the other ones. Georgia voters, looks like the national number there, a 10-point spread between virus over the economy. I know I've got Wisconsin coming up here. This is a big gap when we have Wisconsin. And wait till you see the Nevada numbers, because that's going to be a bit of a surprise for folks. Here's New Hampshire. This is the widest gap of any of our battleground states of virus versus the economy. New England state, the Northeast, has taken this virus seriously from the beginning. But see here, Nevada, looks like Ohio, except flip the other way. 1-point advantage on virus over the economy. Nevada very much has been punished by these lockdowns and the lack of travel, so not surprised that that number is dead even there, and it could be a harbinger that Nevada may be a state we should be keeping a close eye on tonight. Let me bring my panel in here. It's Casey Hunt, who of course is NBC News' Capitol Hill correspondent. It's Joshua Johnson, who is, and also she's host of Way Too Early. Joshua Johnson, host of The Week with Joshua Johnson, also on MSNBC, and NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. Mark, I want to start with this. I know you've been looking at these exit polls longer than I've been able to look at them as I've been on air. I'm a big believer in that question, virus versus the economy. I just think it's the question that sort of has divided the country, because the president himself made it basically, if you will, a divide between the two parties. Interesting findings in this exit poll.
Yeah, that's right, Chuck. And, you ended up having one other additional question you didn't go over is who is best able to handle the coronavirus. And according to the exit poll, you have Joe Biden with the advantage there. Not a surprise for anyone who's looked at our national NBC Wall Street Journal poll or other polls on this front. But Chuck, you're exactly right. The two different messages from the president as well as Joe Biden on the coronavirus couldn't be more different. Joe Biden was closing his campaign and advertisements and on the stump on being able to contain the virus exactly the way that question was asked. President Trump talking about the economy, touting the job growth in the last few months, the recent GDP finding, but not also mentioning many of the job losses and the economic devastation that occurred before then. So I agree with you. It's going to be fascinating to watch these numbers over the night. And Chuck, you ended up having some really good guidance as well. They're going to change. This is a different exit poll that we've had in the past. And I think we're going to be looking at these numbers 2, 3 in the morning and tomorrow morning as well.
Casey Hunt, this question certainly looked, I have to tell you, going through the battleground states on the same question, it sort of comported to where we think each one of these states could be leaning tonight. It was interesting.
It's fascinating, Chuck. And obviously, I mean, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Totally agree.
How many times are we going to say this tonight? We
Yes.
don't want to get ahead of ourselves. However, would anyone really be surprised if the states tracked that way? I mean, we have watched both of these candidates on the campaign trail. The president has talked about getting the economy back open as his most important priority. And Joe Biden has said on the campaign trail, we can't reopen the economy until we get coronavirus under control. And what is dominating people's lives? Two things. First, the virus. And second, so many of them have lost their jobs or their livelihoods. And it would make sense, I think, if, you know, if these percentages wound up lining up with what we actually see in the vote totals as they come in. Now, you know, you have given everyone the usual caveats about the way this vote is so different this time and the limitations of our data for people who showed up on election day versus people who you know, chose to vote before election day. So that for sure, I think, is obviously a very critical piece of this, and we're going to continue to be careful with it. That Nevada number, though, I think you're absolutely right to underscore that. I mean, that's a place where, you know, the president's team has talked about, and Republicans have talked about, the president's, or I think actually perhaps I should frame it as Joe Biden's weakness with Hispanic voters. And obviously, the services industry in Las Vegas just absolutely decimated by this. There's not a lot of safety net there. And, you know, obviously they're really struggling to come back. Sorry, Chuck, go ahead.
No worries. And Joshua Johnson, we did ask a larger question of most important issue, and I want to show that because I think it's important in context. So when we listed most important issue, and there were 5 issues the exit poll offered: economy, racial inequality, the coronavirus, crime and safety, and healthcare policy. Now you saw we had the just economy versus the virus. You saw what that spread was. What's interesting here, Joshua, is when you see most important, economy then gets 34%. The pandemic gets 18%. Racial inequality is at 21%, crime and safety at 11%, health policy at 11%. But again, when you narrowed it down to just those 2 things, it shows you the economy may look like the #1 issue, but there are a lot of nuance that voters are taking with the economy once you introduce the pandemic.
It's about everything that's on that exit poll kind of overlaps. I mean, if we look at it again, you can see that, you know, for some people, or the dichotomy, at least in the debate over racial inequality, did have to do with crime, justice, law and order. And part of that was about whether you view the aftermath of George Floyd's death as an issue of law versus an issue of justice. And those can be 2 different conversations. For many Americans, the entire debate about coronavirus has been about getting the country back open, getting businesses open, getting things back to normal, and that's in parts of the country across the political spectrum, as opposed to a referendum on the president's leadership. I think a lot of what we're going to see today is kind of the way that you articulate what the last 4 years have been about as a referendum on President Trump. Is coronavirus about his leadership in a crisis, or is it about his ability to keep the economy growing? Is the aftermath of George Floyd's death about legacy racial inequality, or is it about the ability of America to have a nation of law and order? And depending on how you view it in different parts of the country, you might see the same issue articulated in any of the wedges of that pie chart you just showed.
All right, I'm going to sneak in a break, but before I do, I'm going to give everybody, I've got a cool toy here. I've got this national number here, most important issue. Now watch, I'm going to start cruising through the battleground states here so you can see, and then I'll sneak in a break right after it. But you can see here, I'm going to go Arizona, economy's at 32, and it's the pandemic that is second, not racial inequality. Next state, Florida, economy at 35, pandemic is second, racial inequality third. Next state is Iowa, economy 1 at 33, pandemic at 20, healthcare third, racial inequality down to 11 there. You go to North Carolina, economy, racial inequality is second. I think you can see a pattern here that we'll talk about in a minute. Ohio, economy a little higher at 38, racial inequality comes in second, then the pandemic. We go through here, Pennsylvania, economy at 38, pandemic at 21, racial inequality at 15. Georgia, economy 36, racial inequality second, 22, coronavirus pandemic 14. We'll keep going here. And Michigan, economy 38, pandemic 19, then racial inequality at 16. And Wisconsin, economy 32, pandemic 21, racial inequality 14. And we'll go one more here, Nevada, economy 38, 36, excuse me, pandemic 20, racial inequality 16, and that ends it there. So there you go. I leave you with that. Coming up, we'll have more exit polls, and we're going to check in with both the Trump and Biden campaigns. Much more on this election night coverage straight ahead on NBC News Now.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you. Whether you're back to school,
what do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work, we're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend.
These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The wind standing these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
No, I don't think it's your fault. Welcome back. Both President Trump and former Vice President Biden are gearing up for a potentially long election night, maybe election week and beyond. President Trump spoke to campaign staff earlier today in Virginia before returning to the White House, where he plans to watch returns tonight. Joe Biden made a few impromptu stops in Pennsylvania on his way back to Delaware, where he will be watching results tonight. Let's check in with both campaigns. Monica Alba is at the White House for us. Mike Memley's in Wilmington. Monica, let me start with you. The president, I heard a lot of positive feelings at around lunchtime today. Are they feeling as good as they did earlier today when they were seeing some of the early turnout numbers in Florida and Pennsylvania?
Cautiously optimistic, Chuck. Yes, that is what seems to be the theme of the afternoon heading into the early evening, with campaign officials telling me they feel good about turnout they're seeing in some of their key battleground states, but also expressing a little bit of anxiety about what they were seeing earlier in the day in Pennsylvania, specifically saying they didn't necessarily know if they had the proper infrastructure for some of the voters who wanted to go out and cast their ballot for Donald Trump, but maybe didn't have the time to wait 2 or 3 hours in line. That's something we heard heard repeatedly. So a little bit of worry from the campaign in that particular state. Of course, that's the one being described to us as being on a knife's edge. It could all come down to that. But we are told by aides the president feels very good about Florida. That's a place, of course, he spent the most collective time campaigning in this entire season because it's his adopted home state, and he has overnighted there and held so many different events. After that, Pennsylvania was the state that he did the most campaign events in. But I'm told to really watch for exactly what you were talking about before the break, which is these exit polls. The Trump campaign really hoping that people are prioritizing the economy over the coronavirus pandemic. That's something they feel could really help them in these closing hours. But a little bit of controversy here at the White House, Chuck, because the president essentially has a war room now running out of this White House complex and grounds, raising all those ethical questions we've seen blurred over the last couple of months. Of course, the president essentially held the Republican National Convention here, which caused a lot of concern for ethical experts, but now he's going to be watching returns in the Oval Office and in the residence. There isn't a Marine behind me at the West Wing, so he's not quite in the West Wing yet, but we do expect to see him there in the next couple of hours watching all of that roll in. And then there will be some kind of festivity in the East Room, but his donors are going to be at the Trump Hotel about a mile away from here, with campaign staff monitoring everything also from headquarters in Virginia. That most telling comment I thought we heard from the president earlier today when he was asked if he had written a concession speech and an acceptance speech. He said, winning is easy, losing is not, particularly not for me, Chuck.
Yeah, every once in a while we hear from the president and he gets he can get oddly self-reflective right in front of our cameras. Monica Alba getting us started at the White House. Monica, thanks very much. Let me go over to Mike Memoli in Wilmington, where the former vice president will be watching returns. So, how do they feel today? They did some same-day barnstorming, while the Trump campaign did not. An interesting split screen between the two campaigns.
Yeah, Chuck, and I've got to say I'm a little envious of our colleague Mariana Sotomayor, who was part of the pool moving around with Joe Biden today, because what I saw was the Joe Biden of the early primaries. He was having fun. He was being nostalgic. He was really reflective and chatting it up with reporters, interacting with voters in a way we really haven't seen him throughout this pandemic phase of the campaign. And on the part of the Biden team, you know, the only sort of divide on the Biden team is how willing they are to be public about their confidence, I have to say, about tonight. Most of this team is not necessarily burdened by 2016 in the way a lot of other Democrats are. They are less, I think, concerned about, you know, the memories of 2016, because most of them weren't part of it. Some of them, of course, were with Biden the whole time. And so the fact that today was a rather quiet election day, we didn't see much in the way of voter issues. The lines weren't necessarily long in a lot of places. That shows that, A, we know that they feel good about the early vote, and the fact that for those who were showing up on election day, there weren't any issues, they think bodes well for them. But really all this comes down to for them, Chuck, is whether it's 2016 versus 2018. Right. The whole Biden strategy has been premised on 2018, what worked with Democrats in that campaign, and they feel that their strategy has paid off to this point.
Yeah, I talked with a strategist earlier today. I said, does this political environment look more like 16 or 18? And it was somebody on the right side, and they said it looks too much like 18, and they were speaking from a Republican point of view. So a very interesting piece of analysis there from you, Mr. Memoli. Mike Memoli, Monica Alba, thank you both. Let me take another look at more of these early exit polls. I want to show you something. Joshua Johnson, Casey Hunt, and Mark Murray are back. I left you guys with some numbers, and I was showing you, and it was, I think, pretty obvious, states with large African-American populations you saw where racial inequality rose to the number 2 spot versus less diverse states where the virus was in the number 2 spot. But I'm going to have a little fun here, Joshua, with the state of Georgia. Because if we're going to sit here and say, and you know, where they picked the economy at 36%, and you saw the number 2 and number 3 issues, racial inequality was 22, and the pandemic was 14. Now, my math is okay. 36. Oh, look at that, 36. And then check out healthcare. We assume is an advantage for the Democrats. That's 11%. Crime and safety. Some people assume that's an advantage for the Republicans. So, look, I don't want to read tea leaves, but it just shows you, I think, how sort of, you know, do the issues tell you which way the partisans are leading, or are the partisans essentially picking the issues that they focus on? Joshua, your thoughts?
I mean, you know, coronavirus, for example, cuts in a couple of different ways. One is just the health aspect of it, of course. The other is the fact that if you are black or brown in this country, you are already less likely to have proper or sufficient health care or any health care at all, or had been prior to, particularly the ACA. And so because of an array of reasons, black and brown people are hit much harder by coronavirus on the whole than whites have been. So that's one piece of it, why coronavirus may factor. The economy has always been top issue for an array of reasons. The economy is the perennial issue. Racial inequality kind of sits in between those two, right? Because coronavirus is a healthcare access issue. It's an equity issue. Yep. The economy is definitely a racial justice issue because that ties into, how our schools are run and our opportunities for advancement and so forth. So in a state like Georgia, North Carolina, I think was the other state where racial inequality was second.
Correct.
You've got large black populations, one, but also large, very educated black populations. You've got North Carolina A&T University, which is the largest historically black university in the country. Atlanta, you've got the big university center, Morehouse, Spelman, et cetera. So the racial complexion, I think, does factor into the balance of those issues, but also because people of color are now one-issue voters, they may just dovetail in ways that you view differently depending on your background.
Casey Hunt, healthcare, #1 advertised issue, arguably, below the presidential ballot. Always sort of the top issue. It is #4 on our issues. Now, of course, the pandemic in many ways may be the, quote, other healthcare issue that maybe healthcare voters are split, but maybe we should be combining those questions together. For instance, if you did it here in Wisconsin, which I have up, coronavirus and healthcare adds up to 30, the economy's at 32. So it's possible that's what we're looking at there when you see that healthcare is a little bit lower than perhaps we were used to seeing in previous years.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Chuck, and I think that's certainly how those groups that have been buying paid media time have been looking at this breakdown. I mean, there is a reason why they are advertising so heavily on healthcare. And I mean, what is the message in the pandemic? It's that if you're a Democrat, Republicans are going to take away your healthcare in the middle of a pandemic when you're at, perhaps elevated risk of getting sick, where you're at elevated risk of potentially losing your job that perhaps has stable health care that you rely on. So yeah, I think it's a little hard when you're using the construct most important issue. I mean, if we had ranked choice exit polling the way they have ranked choice voting in Maine, perhaps we'd get something different here.
Oh man, if we start ranked choicing exit polls, we'll never get out of here, Casey.
Nope, never will.
We'll never get out of here. Mark Murray, it's interesting. I've been messing around with this a little bit, doing some stuff that you and I might do with First Read. So check out Florida here. So the economy's at 35. And if our #2 and 3 issues we know are going to be Democratic dominant issues, right? The pandemic and racial inequality. I'll be very curious to see if you add up these two in this, right? You're getting 34. And so in Florida, economy edges out 2 and 3 combined by a point. It'll be interesting to see in which states which have the advantage. I want to show you something here. In Wisconsin, for instance, on this question, you can see where suddenly it looks like a Democratic advantage on issues. 32 is the economy, but 35 is the combo on the pandemic and racial inequality. It's just one way to potentially slice up the issue bucket here as we look at Trump v. Biden.
Yeah, and Chuck, it's important on this exit poll question to look at the different choices. If they just given you 3 choices, we might actually have different numbers. But it does strike me that the economy is always kind of in the mid-30s. And of course, that was the issue that the president really has tried to talk about, not only in the final weeks of this campaign, but through the duration. And it's been interesting to me how crime, his law and order and crime, has really dropped off recently. He's tried to talk about Antifa and others, but really the big, kind of incident that ended up occurring was when you had that Biden-Harris bus in Texas, and the president, actually kind of almost applauding that kind of activity. And so really that law and order message to me wasn't as important down the stretch as the economic one. Just a final point on healthcare, Chuck, that you and Casey were talking about. One of the reasons why Democrats ended up having that in 2018 and it carried over to 2020 was just to have an affirmative type of issue. A lot of times that Democratic, focus groups and others, when they talk about the president and his own behavior in office and the actions that he's taken, that sometimes depresses their voters. And so actually having an affirmative goal on here's what we want to do. We want to actually expand healthcare for people. We want to promote racial justice in this country, specific ways to achieve that was always better in the Democratic messaging. And they always figured President Trump was baked in. So why not focus on affirmative kind of policies and activities?
Casey, Joshua, Mark, you guys get to stick with us. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to leave you with an exit poll result here. Time of your decision. A stunningly tiny amount of people claim they made their decision in the last week. We show you 2016. We know those late deciders were big for Trump. 13% of the electorate was a late decider. Look at this, though. 4% according to this. When you have 100 million people vote before Election Day, I think you're going to have very few late deciders. Let's turn away from the presidential race for a moment and turn to the other big bid for political control hanging in the balance tonight, the United States Senate. There are 35 Senate seats up for grabs tonight. And how wide the map of winnable seats is for Democrats is likely to rely on how many battleground states Joe Biden can carry. A bad night for Republicans and Donald Trump could easily mean not just losing control of the White House, but the Senate as well. So let me go to a couple of southern states that Donald Trump won in 2016, where a win for a party at the top of the ticket could have dramatic implications down the ballot. We'll have a live report out of Georgia on the 2 Senate races there, but I'm going to first go to South Carolina. That's where we find Leanne Caldwell. She's been reporting on the single most, well, it may be, we'll find out if it's the most expensive Senate race in the country at the end of all this, but Lindsey Graham, Jamie Harrison, astronomical amount of money that Jamie Harrison has been able to raise and spend. The big question is it enough? Is Donald Trump's popularity just enough to drag Lindsey Graham over the finish line? Leanne, what are you hearing?
Hey, Chuck. So, yeah, it was an expensive Senate race. And remember, as you know full well, that South Carolina is a really cheap media market, too. So those dollars go a long way here. As for the president, so the President Trump won South Carolina by 14 points 4 years ago. That's more than McCain won it in 2008, and that's more than Romney won it in 2012. There's there's little indication that the president is going to win it, even close to that, this time around. And that spells trouble for Lindsey Graham, because both Senator Graham and the president have lost support among these suburban, moderate, especially the women. That's according to sources, and that's according to polls. But what's more troubling for Senator Graham is he is also trailing the president here in South Carolina. He's running 3, 4, maybe even 5 points behind the president. So he really needs those conservative voters, those Trump supporters, to put him over the finish line. This morning at a polling place, I caught up with the Democratic challenger, Jamie Harrison, and asked him about how he feels going into this big election day, and listen to what he had to say. Are you concerned in the final days that the math is just too difficult for you, that there are just too many Republicans in the state and that they're going to support Lindsey Graham?
I just said we have 1.3 million people who voted, and 30% of them African American, more than what their elected is. I feel really good about where I believe coming into today, I was in the lead. And I think we will continue that lead going in. So I'm energized. I feel good about where we are.
So he was in the lead partly because 33% of black voters here in South Carolina early voted. They only make up 27% of the population. And we spent the day at Democratic precincts, polling places, and there's not been any lines in places where there were lines in 2016 and previous elections. And we're told because just so many Democratic voters voted early. So what it's going to come down to today is how many Republicans show up to vote, Chuck.
And, of course, with Lindsey Graham, how many Trump voters skip the race, vote for a third-party candidate? We'll see. But I'll give you some math to play with.
Yeah.
If Donald Trump's raw vote number is at 53, 54, 55, probably means good news for Lindsey Graham. If it's at 50, 51, 52, Jamie Harrison is going to probably be a happier person. We shall see. Leanne Caldwell in South Carolina, thank you. Let's go down the Atlantic coast there. Georgia's on my mind for a lot of reasons. Just about everyone else's mind around here, too. We'll have much more live election night coverage here on NBC News Now, right after this.
Today, we're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you. Whether you're back to school,
What do you guys think? We're excited?
or back to work, we're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend.
These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus. The story. The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Welcome back. We're going to continue to go down the ballot, down the Atlantic coast. We're in Georgia, as we promised you before the break, where there are not one but 2 very competitive Senate seats in play. One we know is going to a runoff tonight. It is that jungle primary, if you will. Every candidate is on the same ballot. That is the appointed Senate seat there, Kelly Loeffler. She's the appointed senator. It is going to go in a runoff. 2 major Republicans will split the vote. Democrats going to be the leading vote getter. Be very interesting to see what Raphael Warnock gets. But Blaine, I want you to talk to me about all things David Perdue and Jon Ossoff, because that is the nail biter tonight. Is it going to go to a runoff? And if it doesn't, that's good news, perhaps, for Jon Ossoff.
You know what? That's exactly the big question, and there's a very good chance that it could. There's a very good chance that in a couple of months now, on January 5th, Chuck, you and I are talking about this all over again, and there are not one but 2 Senate runoffs in the state of Georgia, which is just too much to even comprehend right now. But yes, when you look at that race between Jon Ossoff and David Perdue, there's a big chance that it could go to a runoff. Now, that's one that we've certainly seen a lot of back and forth over when it comes to enthusiasm, when it comes to people looking at that seat and hoping to turn it blue. I've got to say that the image, I think, of this whole thing, when you talk about enthusiasm in the state of Georgia, when you talk about the fact that there's been a record turnout, yes, it's because of the presidential election, but from the voters that I've talked to, Chuck, both on the Democrat and Republican side, they say that the fact that these races are so close, that's also fueling them to come out. That's also fueling the turnout. And I think that image-wise, you have to look no further than Barack Obama being here yesterday, coming to talk for Joe Biden, of course, but specifically for the 2 Senate candidates, Reverend Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. And that image of them standing on the stage together waving is exactly what Democrats want and what they're hoping to drive home. Now, let's talk very quickly about that jungle primary. I spoke with Reverend Warnock yesterday, and I kind of asked him about the fact that, yeah, Georgia looks a lot different now than it did 4 years ago, and what does that say to him in looking at this race? And he said, look, it's not something that happened overnight. There's a lot of groundwork that went into this. Of course, we know that since Stacey Abrams lost that race, gubernatorial race, narrowly, 2 years ago, there are more than 800,000 additional voters on the rolls. A good number of them are voters of color. Things like that, other people going out, registering voters, trying to get people to the polls. He said all of that led up to today, and that's why Democrats are so optimistic, both in the presidential race and in those 2 Senate races, Chuck.
And Blaine, Senate debates rarely have an impact, but did that last matchup between Ossoff and Perdue, where he sort of, whatever you want to say, it went viral on Twitter, and Perdue canceled the next debate. Yeah. Are we going to look back at that moment and say, that's how Jon Ossoff became a United States Senator?
Absolutely, I think it had an impact. You know, I think the fact that even you and I are talking about it, how many people actually watch Senate debates that take place in the states across the country. So yes, the fact that people saw that, the fact that people remember it, and the fact that Jon Ossoff and his campaign were kind of happy to be able to point to the fact that David Perdue pulled out of the next and final debate after that certainly bodes well for the campaign. But it also kind of goes back to what so many voters are really going to the polls for. I've spoken to a number of voters, and they say repeatedly, the pandemic and racial issues, that's what they're going to vote for. So when you talk about the pandemic, anything like that that goes viral, certainly good for the Ossoff campaign.
We shall see. Jon Ossoff has basically been running for office since Donald Trump took the oath in the state of Georgia, first in a House race and now this. I think we'll find out if they continue. Blaine Alexander on the ground for us in Georgia. Blaine, thank you. By the way, if either of the Georgia races goes to a runoff, we may not know who controls the Senate until early 2021. Believe it or not, those runoffs are in January. However, if we are waiting for Senate control in January, I can tell you this, it means it wasn't a good night for Democrats tonight, for whatever that's worth. But there are other races that could give us a good idea, so let's take a look at how these Senate races could shake out tonight and in the coming days. Get to the big board here. First of all, I've got another fun little toy. Casey Hunt and Mark Murray are joining me. As you know, I am, Casey, you understand this configuration in the United States Senate. Most normal Americans do not. I always say, not everybody thinks that the United States Senate is always seated in the overhead shot in the Senate chamber, and I always think this is kind of a silly thing. But check out what we could do. We could put our Senate seats into the map of the United States of America. Anyway, I just wanted to show off my toy. I don't know how much more tonight I'm going to be able to do that. But in all seriousness, Casey Hunt, where are Republicans now when it comes to the Senate? Do they think they still have a shot at holding this majority, and where does it go through?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they still think they have a shot, but, that could change pretty quickly depending on what we learn here in the early hours of the evening. I think there's still a sense that it's likely we won't know who controls the Senate and that it's going to take longer to figure that out, even than it will to call the presidential race. But, that kind of goes the same way as the questions about whether we're going to see, is there really still a possibility for a landslide that results in an early call in the presidential race? If there is, so goes likely the Senate. So there's a couple categories here, Chuck, as people are thinking about this. The first, of course, is swing states, purple states, places that are currently held by Republicans. They're on defense. This is Colorado, which Republicans think's gone. Right. Arizona, likely the same. That's Martha McSally. North Carolina with Tom Tillis, probably the most critical one of these. And Maine, which is, of course, the Susan Collins seat. That's got some dynamics that are unique to Susan Collins, but it's possible she's going to be swamped by the national dynamics, even though she may have been one who would have been able to hang on. But that Tillis race is likely where we're going to see control of the Senate. It's really, Cal Cunningham's been dealing with a sex scandal the last couple of weeks. That's, we thought perhaps was going to change the dynamics away from what had been basically a generic ballot test, but it really hasn't, as you know, and our poll had Cunningham, the Democrat, up by 10 points. So, if Democrats sweep there, do really well, then we're looking at red states. We're looking at Iowa, Montana, and South Carolina. Right. If Democrats are winning in those states, if that's the conversation, the Senate is absolutely gone. Republicans want to project some optimism about Michigan, but if the national environment is what we think it's going to be, that's going to be really tough for them.
It's interesting, Mark Murray. As you see, I also have another toy in here. I'm going to make sure I use all my toys in this hour. I'm not sure how much of them I'm going to get to between 7 and 4 a.m. But as you see here, what's amazing is that I wanted to move more of these over in our little slider here. But we've got 10 races here. I'm not comfortable saying I know which way they're leaning right now. I moved Colorado, Michigan, and Minnesota into the Democratic column. I moved Alabama and Kentucky for now in the Republican column. But other than that, right now, I mean, Mark, we know Alaska's going to take a week. before we even get all the results. There's 120,000 ballots that won't even start counting tonight. Arizona, 5 days it took the last time. You know the Georgia stories. Both could end up in runoffs. One may not. I think that's going to be the story to follow all night tonight will be Purdue-Ossoff. Iowa's, we know, is going to be tight tonight. Maine, ranked choice voting is going to take a week to 10 days. Montana takes a while. The North Carolina race. And I'll tell you, looking at the early exits, Mark Murray, I'm not ready to say that we know how South Carolina and Texas are leaning.
So what you're saying, Chuck, is we don't have a lot of clarity. I think that's about right now. And look, Chuck, I do think if we are looking for some type of clarity, the states that you and Casey just mentioned, North Carolina and Iowa, at least have the potential to give us fast results. And of course, if they're close races that kind of go into recount, then yeah, we're not going to know for a while. But there's a possibility that we know who ends up winning North Carolina and Iowa. And to me, those have always been the true kind of test, like the tipping point for control on this kind of map. And so, you know, that's kind of what I'm looking at. But Chuck, one other point here too is our friends at the Cook Political Report often note these races always go one way. Yep. And of course, I do think in 2016 it was kind of a half and half. But normally the close races typically break one way in the election cycles that you and I have been doing this for a while. And I would expect that trend to continue. And so how the political winds are blowing right now, we don't know at this hour or so. Yep. But we might have a better idea 4 hours from now.
And more importantly, we know the presidential vote and Senate vote go together. So the battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, got to keep that in mind. Iowa, North Carolina, and Texas. Keep that in mind. The presidential number and the Senate number are likely to be aligned. Casey Hunt and Mark Murray, let's get started. We got about 9, 12, 10, 11, 12 hours. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you all for being with us this hour, but we're just getting started. I promise. I'll see you again tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now and on your local NBC station. That's right. Lester, Savannah, Andrea, and myself, we're going to be on through the night here as well as on your old school television, too. And we're going to be here tomorrow morning. I'll curl up. We've got sleeping bags. We are ready to go. But for right now, stay tuned to NBC News Now for continuing election night coverage and more from the exit polls. See you soon.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend.
These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
We knew it was coming this year, 2020, an election year, but the year had other ideas. Bump after bump in the road, just to bring us to this crossroads. A president and a former vice president with very different visions.
I will work as hard for those who don't support me as those who do support me. I mean it.
With God's help, we will defend the right to life, religious liberty, free speech, and the right to keep and bear arms.
America will decide who will represent us. Our founding fathers started it, and generations have fought for more. That special power to pick our leaders. We have persevered. Now we choose. Now we vote. It's Election Day 2020.
Morris, you're watching NBC News Now's special Election Day coverage. It is finally here. Presidential elections are always historic, but the U.S. has never seen an election or year quite like this. 2020 started with the impeachment and the Senate acquittal of the president. In February, the U.S. economy went into a recession. In March, the pandemic started, and we are still seeing record daily COVID cases. Over the summer, there were mass protests calling for police reform and racial equality. And here we are, Election Day 2020, in less than an hour. The first polls will close in Georgia and South Carolina, as well as Indiana, Kentucky, Vermont, and Virginia. At 7:30 Eastern, West Virginia and battleground North Carolina, Bellwether, Ohio will all close their polls. The Hawkeye State has a near-perfect record of picking the president, voting for the eventual winner in every election but one since the 1940s. Millions of voters across the country today are joining more than 100 million Americans who have already voted, that number shattering early voting records. We have reporters fanned out across critical states and counties. Look at that. They are tracking every development everywhere as this election comes to a close. But first, we start with the candidates. Joe Biden taking advantage of the final hours of campaigning today, making one last swing through Pennsylvania before heading home to Wilmington, Delaware to wait for the results. President Trump spent the day in and around Washington, D.C., stopping there at his campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, to rally the troops one last time. NBC News, several hundred people are invited. That's where we find NBC News political reporter Monica Alba tracking the Trump campaign. NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli is in Wilmington, Delaware, covering the Biden campaign. Mike, let's start with you and three things. Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania. Both candidates have spent a significant amount of time there throughout the campaign and in these last days. How is the Biden campaign feeling about winning that state?
Well, where was Joe Biden on the final 3 days of this campaign? Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania. If there was one state that Joe Biden really premised his candidacy on in a lot of ways, it is Pennsylvania. He is from neighboring Delaware. When he was in the Senate, he was sometimes called the third senator from Pennsylvania because of how much he was engaged on behalf of that state. And the makeup of the electorate there is very squarely what Biden's team calls the Biden coalition. You have working class voters both in northeastern Pennsylvania and in western Pennsylvania. You have a significant African-American vote in Philadelphia. You have significant suburban women, especially in the Philadelphia area, and a lot of senior vote as well. And that's what Biden's team felt is a unique coalition to him, that he could win and win back that state. And as I've been talking to both the Biden campaign and to members of the Pennsylvania delegation closely watching results so far, looking at the early vote, they feel very good. Polling showed Biden with probably a 5-point average lead, and they believe that that's holding up and then some, despite some of the concerns, because remember, Pennsylvania was, of all the battleground states, the state with the least early vote. most day of vote, and so that made it potentially susceptible to a late swing. But all indications from our exit polling as well are that there wasn't a late swing, that most voters decided well in advance who they were going to support, Allison.
Monica, President Trump flipped Pennsylvania in 2016. Does the campaign think they can pull off a win again?
Look, Allison, they think that the Keystone State may be where this entire thing comes down to in terms of how close it may be. That's why they invested so much time, which is really the most precious asset you have in the closing weeks of a campaign, which is the candidate himself. He was there over the weekend, the president stopping in 4 different places in the Commonwealth, dedicating more than 12 hours of time on Saturday to campaigning there. They really believe that that kind of turnout for them can be translated into turnout at the polls today. So we just got off of a campaign call with aides and allies of the president who are looking at what is going on right now and seeing very long lines, particularly in Pennsylvania, and they are blaring out a message to all of their supporters. Please stay in line, don't leave. Even if the polls are closed, we want you to stay there and cast your ballot. That is the message now that all of his surrogates are amplifying because they think this could be the critical state. Of course, the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, crucial in delivering the president the White House back in 2016. Aides telling me they're not as confident about what they're seeing in Michigan and Wisconsin, but they want to be able to hold on to Pennsylvania. They're feeling a little bit better about what they're seeing internally so far in Florida and North Carolina. Now, those are 2 states that when those polls do close in just a little bit here, we will have a good picture of where the night might be heading. Pennsylvania, that will likely take days, Allison, because of all the mail-in ballots, of course.
Mike, let me ask you about some of these other key states. Joe Biden and Donald Trump locked in some very close races in a number of battleground states. Where does the Biden campaign see its path to victory?
Well, they say they have multiple pathways. There's the one that Joe Biden spent most of the closing days of the campaign beyond Pennsylvania. It was that a blue wall path, what Hillary Clinton lost. Those had been comfortable Democratic-leaning states in previous presidential elections. Think Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Then they have what they would call that Sun Belt path, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, as well as Arizona. The Biden campaign actually laid out today all the ways he could win, even if he doesn't win Pennsylvania, even if he doesn't win Pennsylvania and Florida. They still think they have very realistic pathways to do that. But the other thing that the Biden campaign tends to think when you talk to senior advisors is that, especially that blue wall group, they will tend to move together. So what happens in Michigan is probably also happening in Wisconsin, and to a lesser extent happening in Pennsylvania. So they've always felt that was the surest pathway for the Biden campaign to victory. The problem with that one, though, is that it's also the latest counting of those states. So they'd much rather see an early and projection of victory in Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, which we think is possible, at least the early count, not necessarily the projection one way or the other.
Mike, Biden is expected to take the lead with early voters, but what was his closing message today to those folks going to vote in person?
You know, it was interesting because we've talked so much about what it's been like to campaign in a pandemic. I saw Joe Biden today that we really haven't seen since the early primaries. He was interacting with voters a little bit more. He was very reflective and nostalgic at times, but he was still committing to be a president for all Americans. And there was a poignant moment, in fact, when he went to Scranton, of course, his hometown. He actually went to the home that he spent time growing up in, and he wrote on the walls that from this house to the White House by the grace of God. So an interesting day for the former vice president. I was with him on 2 previous election days in 2008 and 2012. Both those days were flights to Chicago to join President Obama, but today he'll be here in Delaware, spending the night watching results with his family and potentially coming to the stage that's set behind me to potentially address the nation one way or the other.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Micah, a sentimental and emotional day, whatever the outcome. Monica, President Trump encouraged his supporters early on to vote in person, not by mail. He is still questioning the mail-in ballots, particularly in Pennsylvania. What are you hearing about any legal challenges the Trump campaign might be preparing or what they're considering here?
Republicans are very much expecting legal battles, Allison, and that's why they've spent the last 6 to 8 months preparing lawyers and election-related lawsuits. They are ready to deploy those, particularly in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned. And yes, the president falsely implied last night during some of his very last rallies of the 2020 cycle that there will be cheating going on somehow in Pennsylvania if they're counting ballots after Election Day. But of course, the Supreme Court ruled that that would be allowed in some cases. And we should again remind everybody, the president has sort of implied that he doesn't like the fact that after tonight, ballots will continue to be counted. That's always what happens, and just to a higher degree this year because of the coronavirus pandemic and the volume of mail-in ballots, that will take longer process and depending on which state and state rules. So while he continues to raise the specter of widespread voter fraud, we need to remind everybody there is simply no evidence of that, and certainly not in Pennsylvania, though again, it will take days to have a full picture of what this will look like, which is completely natural given the health crisis, Allison.
Monica and Mike, great to see you both. It's kind of fun, all being dressed up. We're all out of the house again. It almost feels like a normal election day. It's kind of cool.
It's been
great. Like election night, though.
Great to see you guys. Thank you. The polls in Pennsylvania close in less than 2 hours, as we have been saying. This is a state that could decide who becomes the next president. Nearly 2.5 million people have already voted there, but some counties won't process their mail-in ballots until tomorrow. MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi is outside a polling station in Philadelphia. Ali, it's great to see you. I feel like we haven't chatted in a long time. President Trump was the first Republican to take Pennsylvania since 1992, winning the state by less than a percentage point in 2016. Peter Alexander and Carol Lee are reporting today that the Trump campaign is concerned about turnout there. What have you been seeing on the ground?
Yeah, so Donald Trump won the state by 0.7%, 44,000 votes. So he is looking to desperately to hold on to this thing. If you look at all the combinations of ways that Donald Trump can get 270 electoral votes, most of those ways run through Pennsylvania. If he doesn't win Pennsylvania, it's going to be a hard night for him. So as Monica was saying, depending on how Florida goes and North Carolina goes, Pennsylvania will become more important as the course of the night goes through. Here's the issue. We're in Philadelphia. Joe Biden's going to win Philadelphia. He was here. In fact, I think he's still here. He's been here all day. The issue is, will he win it by the kind of margins that Barack Obama had or by the kind of margins that Hillary Clinton had? Because a lot of places in the rest of the state are red. There's definitely a lot of strength, a lot of Democratic strength in Philadelphia County, where we are here, and in Allegheny, which is Pittsburgh. But the issue is turnout. Now, we're not seeing lineups right now at most polling booths, but we have heard upward of 65% turnout so far, if you count people in person and mail-in ballots. Raheem Ellis was reporting upward of 70% in another part of Philadelphia. So no lineups here. In fact, I had people coming up to me saying, what can I do to help her? I brought food, I brought snacks for people in line. There's no lineup. There were lines earlier this morning. There have been about 50 instances of phone calls about voter intimidation in the Philadelphia area. We've heard most of those were resolved without incident. About an hour from here in Berks County, there's a problem at one poll where people are lined up and they have not been able to process the ballots, but they're working on that right now. But that's what we have at the moment. Largely peaceful voting going on, uneventful in Philadelphia, but this is going to become very important over the course of the next few hours.
Absolutely, and at least friendly people offering snacks, Ali, that I hope they left with the local MSNBC anchor who might be hungry.
Yeah, that's right. Feed the anchor. It's always welcome.
It's a great idea. Let me ask you, Ali, you mentioned this. Philadelphia is key. Joe Biden there today telling supporters that Philly could be key to winning this election. What are Pennsylvania voters there telling you about the candidates, even though we know that Philadelphia very likely to go in Joe Biden's favor?
Yeah, look, I've been around this state. Last weekend I was in Luzerne County, which everybody's looking at because it was a county that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. This last-minute push by Donald Trump about fracking, about Joe Biden's position on fracking, he's hoping to have some impact, but not in Philadelphia. People in Philadelphia are not really worried about fracking. He's going to take his glasses off because they're foggy. I spoke to two voters, actually, just a little while ago at this poll, and one of the things Donald Trump's been saying today on Twitter and this morning on Fox is he's worried about this concept of delaying the outcome of the vote for mail-in ballots, counting them on Friday, is not only a bad idea and undemocratic and unfair, he said it'll lead to violence in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has had some tension in the last week. There was a police shooting in West Philadelphia, and the National Guard was out for that. The National Guard is here, but not for election preparedness. There are actually no indications of violence in Philadelphia tonight. Here's what two voters told me a couple of hours ago.
The
It was my first time voting in a presidential election this year, so I was really proud, and it was a very easy process, no line, just got in and out, casting my vote, went really well.
Donald Trump was saying earlier today, and he's tweeted out such, that he thinks this whole way it's going down in Philadelphia, including the fact that mail-in ballots can be counted until Friday, it's not just a bad idea, but it's going to lead to violence. He's talking about that. You look very perplexed by that.
I don't agree with that. I don't think it's going to lead to violence per se, at least not in my city, you know?
I feel as though in Philadelphia, a lot of us are going to be pretty neutral, it's not going to be a lot of violence here at all.
So that's the situation for us here in Philadelphia. We're obviously going to be watching the rest of the country very closely to determine how important the results from Philadelphia are to this election. Allison?
Absolutely, Ali Velshi. And, you know, maybe after the election, when we're all back here at 30 Rock, we could talk about some kind of product, some kind of new business idea to help with the fogging glasses. I have not figured this out yet. You put glasses on, you put a mask on, and there's just no winning that battle.
I get people tweeting me all the time, put tape here, do that, put on your glasses.
Doesn't help.
This happens to me all the time. I cannot figure it out.
I can't either. We're going to work on that. You and I will come up with something, we'll get rich. Thanks, Ali.
Love it.
More than 10 million people have already voted in Florida, according to the state's Division of Elections. The counties along the I-4 corridor there could determine the outcome. Among them, Pinellas County, which has voted for the winning president 9 out of 10 times since 1980. That's where we find NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders. Kerry, early vote counts show Democrats have a slight advantage in Florida. What are you seeing? What are you hearing on the ground there?
Well, when we look at Pinellas County, as you just pointed out, 40 years of picking the proper president-elect. And so all eyes are on Pinellas County. Certainly both campaigns are looking at this county. We have the latest numbers now available in this county as of 5:20 p.m. First of all, take a look at this. 79.4% of registered voters in the state of Florida in Pinellas County have voted here. That's a tremendous number, certainly a record. Now, if you're wondering who those voters were, we break it down. 44.2% Republicans, 45.48% Democrats, and then let's zero in on that no party affiliation. That 36.7%, that is the key block to watch here in Pinellas County. And because Pinellas County often reflects the state, if you look at that group of independent voters, if they break for one candidate or the other, that'll generally tell us where things go. Now, the polls are still open here in Pinellas County, as they are in the Eastern time zone here in Florida. They close at 7, and then we have the Central time zone where the polls will close because Florida has 2 time zones. But as early as 7:10, 7:15 p.m., we're going to start seeing some results from places like here in Pinellas County. A lot of enthusiastic supporters that you hear over my shoulder. We did get a chance to talk to some of those folks who didn't do early voting, didn't do mail-in voting, but rather decided today was the day. It was part of something that they wanted to be a part of Election Day. They waited in lines here. Some line lasted more, at one point for more than an hour. Let's listen to what some of the voters told us about participating in this monumental and very important historic election.
It feels good to vote for me, and I wanted to vote in person today because I didn't want to worry about slow mail. I didn't want to worry about any problems. I want to make sure that I put in the ballot myself.
I said, for me, you know, there's a sense of camaraderie coming on voting day, so that's why I wanted to come this morning.
We just like voting on the day.
The ritual?
Yeah, the day, election day.
The fact that there might be violence in the United States following an election, your reaction?
Yeah, I think it's very upsetting. I mean, we're a democracy. You have a right to vote whomever you wish to vote for, and so do I. But I'm not going to attack you because you didn't vote the way I voted, nor should you attack me because I didn't vote the way you thought I should vote. That's what democracy is all about.
Whoever won, whoever lost, they're going to accept it. I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. We have to accept it because in this country we have democracy.
That last voter that you heard speaking there, he's originally from Haiti, and I really think it underscores his feeling about the fact that we must accept what the results are when they gather. Either it's all gathered up tonight or whether we have to wait some time. Yeah. Because in Haiti, they have seen so much violence following much of the politics over there for 50 years. So to think about him saying that we must accept it really says a lot, Allison.
It sure does. Carrie, his beautiful accent gave him away. And just all of the folks that you spoke with today sharing the sentiment that we have different opinions, and that's okay. That's what democracy is all about, respecting people's right to vote as they choose. Carrie, a big concern for a lot of Americans is how long it could take before we have results. It could take several days in some state, but I know Florida got a head start in counting those ballots. When are we expecting to have final results there?
Well, it's really fortunate that Florida had its meltdown. I mean, to look at it in the rearview mirror in 2000, because they built a system now that works. So what we've been doing in the state of Florida is folks have been voting by mail-in or in person. And as those envelopes have been arriving, the supervisor of elections have been opening the envelopes, taking out the ballots, running them through the computers. The computers already know what those vote totals are, but nobody else knows, not even the supervisor of elections in each of the 67 counties knows, but they have those vote totals. So at around 7:10, 7:15, we're going to start seeing those counties in the Eastern time zone popping out their results very quickly. I want to put a little caveat in there because mail-in ballots tend to lean towards Democrats. In-person voting, especially day of voting, seems to lean more towards Republicans. So if you see early vote totals coming back in Florida at 7:15, 7:30, and it starts telling you that Joe Biden is winning Florida, hold on, give it some time, let it work its way through. By tonight, I think maybe at around 11 o'clock tonight, if the system holds as it's expected to do, we'll probably see a pretty close decision, a pretty close timetable of the decision being made in the state of Florida. And of course, Florida has 29 electoral votes, Allison. This is a gargantuan amount of electoral votes for whoever wins it.
Yeah, it's a biggie, and we will certainly be watching Florida. Carrie, whoever wins tonight, you have certainly won already for the most enthusiastic group of voters we have seen in a live shot. Let them know we very much appreciate their passion.
Yeah. Okay, absolutely.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend. These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
More than 3 million people in Ohio voted before Election Day, shattering previous early voting records. Polls closed there at 7:30 Eastern, and folks are still turning out. NBC News correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joining us now from Columbus, Ohio. Kelly, what have the lines been like today? How has the turnout been?
Well, Allison, good to be with you. There have been a consistent sort of level of lines, and we were told at this particular spot in Franklin County, which is the Columbus area, that early this morning they had a very robust group of people waiting, and so like half an hour, 45-minute wait. In the hours that we've been here, it's been steady, consistent voting, but not long lines and not difficulty for those who want to get in before 7:30 when polls close. Of course, as it goes in many places, if you're in line at 7:30, they will mark the end of that line, and those people who might not get in the door right at 7:30, but if they've been in line, they get a chance to still vote. And then at that point, that is when the state is able to begin counting those early ballots that you referred to that have been processed today, but the running of them, the calculation and tally, does not happen until polls are closed. So the first big batch of results that we would expect to get back would be from those early mail-in ballots. And statistically, and traditionally, and demographically, people in both parties expect that those will heavily favor Joe Biden because the early vote tends to be more Democratic. We'll see how that plays out. But one of the things that's been important about knowing that is that understanding that the results may shift through the night as returns come in, and that an early lead for one candidate may not reflect the overall picture. So we'll have to see where that goes. Of course, 4 years ago, 2016 was a big year for Donald Trump. He won this state by a sizable margin. All sides say it's going to be closer this time, and it could be something where Joe Biden can win Ohio. It could be something where Donald Trump would repeat and win again. So we've seen lots of voting today, lots of activity, but in the places where we have been, just anecdotally, it's been a comfortable pace. It has not been a burden on voters having to wait too long. Allison?
Kelly, we've heard some anecdotes like that across the country today where I think people got up early. They wanted to make sure they got in. They waited a little bit, and then as the day went on, maybe the lines just weren't quite so bad. We did hear that Franklin County had some tech issues today at the polls. What happened, and what's the latest there?
Well, very early on, they discovered that there was some lack of synchronicity between the electronic poll book, like the list of registered voters available electronically. So the backup is to use the paper polling books. It's not about the vote itself. It's not about the calculation. It's about the check-in point for voters where they can come in, show their identification, find out their specific precinct, those kinds of things. And they went back kind of old school with the paper polling books. So again, not an impact on the votes that are cast and how they're tallied, but part of the process for voters as they were going through that today. So the Secretary of State had that backup plan of the paper backup. They used that. And we've checked in with the office, and they have not told us of any real areas of concern in terms of any irregularities or troubles with voting. And that also may be a sign of so many people voting early. One of the other sort of differences in pacing that we've seen is in a normal year, you'd have that early morning rush, you'd have a lunchtime rush, and you'd have an after work crowd. Well, we're in a pandemic. Many people are working from home, or they're not in their usual kind of work environment. So even that, in terms of the rhythm of the voting day, feels a little different this year. Allison?
Yeah, Kelly, it seems that everything is just a little bit different this year. I'd love to talk for a moment about the history there in Ohio. The state has a nearly flawless record of choosing the president. What are you hearing from voters there? I realize this is quite a big deal. They usually get it right.
It is something that is a point of pride, and one of the ways that makes Ohio a battleground for the quadrennial event that is the election. Truly a swing state. because they have gone for Democrats and Republicans and back and forth over time. So the phrase that's used during presidential elections is, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. So the predicting factor has been so high. You go back to 1960, Ohio voted for Richard Nixon. That was John F. Kennedy's year, so that was a miss. But other than that, they've gotten it right. So for Donald Trump, no Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio. He won it last time. He would more than likely need to win it again tonight if he is to get a second term. Just the math in terms of that available 18 votes as it currently is in terms of electoral votes, and how would you make that up without Ohio? So that's a big, big piece of it. There are ways for Joe Biden to get there without Ohio, but Ohio is hoping, voters certainly, that they can keep that streak of knowing the pulse of the country, whether it goes Democrat, Republican, back and forth. So that's the history. Will Ohio live up to that history tonight? That's something we'll be watching into the late hours. Now, Ohio also gets 10 days after Election Day for counting of mail-in ballots or military ballots or those kinds of things. It's also had a history of being able to get a bulk of the vote done by 11 or midnight or what have you. So we might hear a lot about Ohio's results tonight, or it may take a little longer, hard to know. But because there was such a huge push on the front end with mail-in ballots and the ability to begin running them at 7:30, that could give us a calculation of a big chunk of the vote fairly early in the evening. And again, it's that notion of watching that as the hours go by, the areas where President Trump might have greater strength may come in later. So a snapshot at 8 or 9 p.m. might be quite different than what you'd see at midnight, for example.
Kelly, we will be watching to see if that great Ohio tradition holds or if that goes out the window too in 2020. Always wonderful to see you. Thank you so much. Trump won Michigan by less than 11,000 votes in 2016. Support from blue-collar and white rural voters helped Trump turn the state red after it voted blue for 25 years. The polls there close at 9 p.m. Eastern. NBC News correspondent Heidi Prisbilla joining us now from Detroit. Heidi, you spoke to the Michigan Secretary of State earlier. What did she tell you about the turnout today?
Yeah, Allison, Michigan is a very decentralized system, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, so it is going to take a while for those results to come in, but she told us that does not mean that we don't already know a lot, just based on these overall turnout numbers. Look, in 2016, the way that Donald Trump won this state was because turnout was depressed in major urban areas like Detroit, like Lansing, but now she says that we are seeing blockbuster turnout. Take a listen.
We're already seeing record vote by mail turnout or absentee turnout, and judging by the folks who participated today, we're going to really see probably more people vote in Michigan this year than ever before in recent history in our state, and that's a great thing. We've also seen 18,000 people register and vote today, eligible citizens, so we're seeing a lot of new voters as well all across the state, particularly in our larger jurisdictions, and a lot of smooth experiences at the polling places as well, which is great.
So, Allison, the Secretary of State also told us specific geographic areas where we are seeing these turnout surges. They're taking place, for instance, here in Detroit, where turnout was depressed in 2016. This is a majority blue area. We're seeing turnout in Kalamazoo, turnout in Ann Arbor. What are those? Those are college towns where younger people are showing up, including on the same day that they vote, registering to vote. So take all of those things together, and you can see why Democrats are feeling confident in this state where Donald Trump had his narrowest margin of victory in 2016.
Heidi, given the record early and absentee voting that we are seeing this year, what are election officials doing to count ballots as efficiently as possible? I know they got a lot on their hands this year.
They certainly do. Look, they have got to count these ballots just starting this morning, given this record crush of these early absentee votes. They've already seen 3.2 million come in. So what you saw was an epic marshaling of resources here, including the major sports teams, the Lions and the Pistons renting out their stadiums and their arenas, allowing for votes to be counted so that the poll workers can be socially distanced. And in the Pistons arena, for instance, they were having trainings for weeks before the election to get all of these volunteer citizens up to speed so that they could start first thing right at 7 a.m. to start feeding those machines so that we will be getting results not only from the in-person votes, which we're expecting may be tilting a little bit more red at the same time that we're getting these absentee votes, which may be in Joe Biden's favor. The Secretary of State told us, no, we're going to be getting these results all at the same time. So really an epic effort here by the city, as well as officials all around the state during a pandemic to recruit poll workers to come in and get the job done. Even so, it may still be a while before they get all of the ballots counted. She told us possibly 80 hours, up to 80 hours, Allison.
Wow. Heidi, Michigan is also allowing open carry on Election Day. I know some folks there were worried about voter intimidation leading up to today. How are people feeling about voting today? What have you heard? Has this been an issue or a concern?
You know, we've been at a number of polling locations. We've interviewed the mayor in Sterling Heights. We've talked to the AG. She was visiting all kinds of polling locations all around Detroit and Detroit proper, and they just didn't see it. It just didn't happen. And, you know, the only issue really was some reports of robocalls targeting voters in Flint, some text messages to voters in Dearborn. But the FBI said, look, that's nothing out of the ordinary. We always have shenanigans like this around the election, and there's no indication that this was any kind of broad effort to suppress the vote, or that, frankly, it had really any effect.
All right, Heidi, thank you so much. We appreciate your input from Greater Michigan and the Detroit area tonight on election night.
Thank you.
Joe Biden looking to put North Carolina back in the blue column, and Durham County could help him do that. Voters there have backed the Democrat in every presidential election since 1976. NBC News correspondent Tremaine Lee joining me now from Greensboro, North Carolina. Tremaine, black voters, a key voting bloc for Democrats. You have been speaking to a few of them today. What are they telling you about the importance of this election in 2020?
Allison, I'll tell you what, after a year in which COVID-19 disproportionately impacted black folks and black communities, and unrest over police violence also consumed them. But what they say is also concerning is 4 years of what they perceive as Donald Trump's racism and racist rhetoric. And so they said today, when they voted, they wanted to see a change, and something had to happen, and they wanted their voices to be heard. Let's take a listen.
We have to change the mindset of our country. You know, I grew up in the 50s and 60s here in Durham. I fought through the civil rights movement. You know, I marched with Ben Ruffin. I met Martin Luther King. I fought in the 50s and 60s. I see us going backwards. This can't continue. This cannot continue.
There's that deep concern that if they're all the struggle and all the fighting for rights, that here we are in this position again, and these voters said, hopefully, maybe now is the time for change.
Tremaine, more than 4 million people in North Carolina voting early. What kind of voter turnout have you been seeing at the polls today? Did most folks vote early? Are they still showing up this afternoon, this evening?
You know, that was the question. After early voting, we saw those lines wrapped around buildings, and there was so much excitement, energy, and also frustration that so many folks across the country and in North Carolina had to wait so long to vote. Today, county officials are saying, you know, in Guilford County, where we are in Greensboro, very few lines at all. And so when we were out there over in Durham, we also didn't see much. But those who did vote today said they were intentional about voting today because it was special for them. They didn't want to mess around with any absentee voting or any mail-in ballots. They wanted to be there to make their voices heard in person.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of people saying they didn't want to mess around. They were showing up, and others saying they liked the tradition of Election Day, so they were still going out today. Tremaine, we do have some early results from the NBC News exit poll of early and Election Day voters, and according to that, about a third of voters said the economy was the most important issue when they voted. Racial injustice, the most important issue for 21% of voters across the U.S., while another 18% said the coronavirus outbreak was the most important issue for them. What are voters there telling you about what's driving them to the polls? Which of these issues have been coming up in your conversations?
About all three, but let's not mistake it. When you list those three, the economy, COVID-19, and unrest and everything, when it hits black folks, they're all together. Yeah. There is no disconnect between the way that black folks have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and the loss of these hourly wage workers, et cetera, and then engaging with the system on every level, whether it's police or otherwise. And so that's exactly what was driving folks out today. After 4 years, especially after this last year, it's been tough on a lot of folks, and this is their mechanism. This is the way they can engage the process and hopefully push for some change.
Tremaine, we're also keeping a close eye on the Senate race there between incumbent Tom Tillis and his Democratic challenger Cal Cunningham. Tell us about voter enthusiasm there for the down-ballot candidates. Are people amped up for this race?
They really are. I mean, on one hand, it's kind of been a soap opera that's consumed the state, right? On one hand, you have the Democrat, Cal Cunningham. There's a sexting scandal. On the right, you have the incumbent Tom Tillis, who contracted COVID while engaging with the White House in these super spreader events. But it's still razor close. Obviously, you have the incumbent Tom Tillis, but that a Democrat is still hanging in there, given the circumstances. But talking to folks, they say, and you know, when you talk to people on the ground, they say it's not just about the federal elections. You know, our state representatives, our federal representatives, it really does matter. So they definitely are thinking about this. It's on their mind. But again, you can't get around the big ticket, Biden and Trump.
Yeah, you certainly can't. Tremaine Lee in North Carolina, great to see you. A tight race in Arizona where Joe Biden and President Trump are tied at 48% with likely voters, according to the last NBC News Marist College poll in the state. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard caught up with voters in Maricopa County.
Here on the ground today, you're seeing a Republican advantage. More than 2-to-1 Republicans over Democratic voters that are voting here actually in person. This is per data provided by Maricopa County Recorder's Office. At the same time here, we should note that Democrats were far outpacing Republicans among early ballots that were returned. And that is why Republican operatives that I talked to here in the state said they needed to see this high in-person turnout, which they are getting right now. Yet at the same time, I think it is important that we look at this race tonight here in Arizona under this lens. Back in 2016, there were 7% more Republicans that voted in the election than Democrats. 7%, 2016. Here in 2020, that number is now 2%. And so the question is, with that 5-point difference there, how much over the course of the rest of the day can Republicans continue to juice their turnout here on Election Day itself? We are still waiting for some numbers when it comes to the rural part of the state, but also those that are dropping off their mail-in ballot in person. We don't have that data yet. I want to let you hear, though, from one voter who is voting for Donald Trump here today, yet didn't vote in 2016. These are the types of voters that the Trump campaign needs more of. Take a listen.
In 2016, I did not vote just because I did not take the time to do it. This time, I think that there's no choice with all the destruction that's going on in the country, and the two candidates that are available. There's one, in my mind, one clear choice because something has to be done. I'm pro-Trump because I think Mr. Biden's tired and he should be doing other things.
Now, the question for Republicans, Allison, is how many folks like that gentleman are coming out here today across the state of Arizona? Donald Trump won it by just 3.5 percentage points back in 2016. And troubling for this campaign is when you look at independents. Polling has consistently shown over the months that Donald Trump is underwater, as much as up to 20% among independents. And independents make up about 1/3 of the electorate here. So that 3.5 percentage point win that he had in 2016, there's very little room for error here when you're looking at this campaign over these next hours. Big questions here in what is expected to be a close night out of the state of Arizona, Allison.
A historic day in Green Bay, Wisconsin. For the first time, the Packers are opening up their indoor tailgating venue to voters. That's where we find NBC News correspondent Kevin Tibbles at the Johnsonville Tailgate Village. Kevin, what are you hearing from voters there?
Well, Allison, first off, yes, we're just steps away from Lambeau Field, obviously the temple of football here in Green Bay. Just behind me is the tailgate, indoor tailgating place. And the real good thing for voting here today is the fact that, in spite of the fact we're in Green Bay, Allison, it was over 60 degrees. There were lineups outside this building even before the polling started this morning, and people are starting to drop by after work. Interestingly enough, no matter who they were voting for, Republican or Democrat, many of these people were saying to us that this was the most important election that they were taking part in their lifetime. Have a listen.
Like I said before, too many people died for me to have the right to vote, so I gotta exercise that right. So, may the best man win.
What's the big issue for you?
I would say the economy.
Jobs?
Yeah. I think that affects everybody.
Any issues this time around that are more important to you?
For me, it's like pro-life, things like that.
Now, when you're listening to these people, one of the things that I picked up or noticed is that a lot of people standing in line here today were actually reticent to tell us which way they were going. I think, and a number of people said this to us, that the way the country has been divided over the last 4 years, many people aren't really publicly saying which way that they're going to be going. And we noticed that right throughout the day here. I think that probably has is also part of the reason why so many people, not only here, but right across Wisconsin, actually did absentee voting and voting by mail. Some 65% of the residents or the voters here in Wisconsin have already cast their vote in terms of how many people cast the overall vote 4 years ago. So people are engaged, and people seem to be very involved, and people are still sort of funneling themselves into this voting place at Lambeau Field tonight on their way home from work. Allison.
Kevin, let's talk a little bit more about turnout there. The mayor of Green Bay is saying the polls could be less congested because of the record number of absentee ballots. But I do see people lined up behind you. What's the case at your polling site? What has it been like there tonight?
Well, essentially, this place has never been used before for polling, for voting, and the reason it is being used is because of COVID. Unfortunately for Wisconsinites, their state at this point in time is a COVID hotspot. They set another all-time record today, as a matter of fact, for new cases of COVID and lost more than 50 lives. That is one of the reasons why it was chosen, it was decided to use this tailgate facility, which is indoors, because obviously Green Bay is famous for its winter weather. So this is indoors, large parking facilities. People can come here from wherever. A number of precincts are voting here, and that's the reason why this is being used. Having said that, you're absolutely right. There are record numbers here in Green Bay as well. 55% of the people who voted last time, the numbers voting last time, have already voted with mail-in and absentee balloting. So a lot of people decided to do it by mail, but as you can see, people consider this to be very important, and they're coming out here tonight to make their mark.
Kevin, I think the biggest shock in Wisconsin tonight is that you said it's 60 degrees there in November. I can't believe it. That's amazing. Send that weather east. I think we're getting it this weekend, and we will take it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Allison.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Washington feels more chaotic than ever. It's my job to ask the tough questions, left and right, and help you make sense of it all.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder
of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
Voters turning out across South Carolina today where there is a high-stakes Senate contest on the ballot. Incumbent Republican Senator Lindsey Graham up against Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison. That race could help Democrats take control of the Senate. NBC News correspondent Leanne Caldwell is outside a polling place in Columbia, South Carolina.
We've spent the day at a couple polling places in Columbia in a predominantly Democratic part of this state, and there were pretty sleepy conditions at these polling places, and we're told because there are so many Democrats who voted early, and that's why they're saying that places that usually have long lines on Election Day are not seeing those long lines. So Democrats are confident heading into Election Day that they're well positioned, but like around the country, Republicans are most likely to vote on Election Day, and we're still waiting for those numbers to come in. We caught up with Democratic candidate Jamie Harrison early in the day at one of those polling places, and he sounded confident. He said Senator Lindsey Graham needs to be concerned. The reason he feels that way is because a third of early voters were black voters here in South Carolina, and that is a big number considering they're only 27% of the population. Now, Senator Graham has been running a campaign to the right, tying himself to the president as much as possible. He's been relying on the fact that he was able to push through Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. He flat out told us that that has helped him tremendously in his reelection. So, you know, both sides are saying, obviously, turnout matters. Polling places are going to close within the hour, and we could start to see results soon after that. Both sides are hoping that the result is called tonight, but there is some indication that it might take until tomorrow, especially if this race is extremely close.
Texas shattered early voting records in 2020. More than 9 million people there voted early. That's more than all of the votes in the state in the 2016 election. It's also the state with the most confirmed coronavirus cases in the country right now, over 960,000. In El Paso, new curfews and shutdowns are in effect. Field hospitals are now open with local hospitals at capacity. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky is joining us now from El Paso. Morgan, according to NBC News' exit poll of voters, 51% nationwide say that COVID containment efforts are going badly, 35% very badly. How are voters in El Paso being assured they are safe to vote given the serious COVID situation there?
Yeah, Allison, good evening. And El Paso certainly finds itself at an interesting crossroads here with the pandemic and the election playing out in real time and a 2-week shutdown being ordered for this city as of late last week by the county judge, which acts as sort of a city manager here in Texas. As far as those safeties that are being put into place for people who go to the polls, we know that if you show up here to vote at one of these polling locations here in El Paso, you'll get a bag with a sanitation wipe in it, a finger covering, and a Q-tip there in order to make sure you don't have any extra contacts with any of the voting machines. In the meantime, that shutdown has closed down all non-essential businesses, and city leaders here are saying that people shouldn't really go out unless they absolutely have to, although they have been openly encouraging people to make sure they go to the polls. As it stands right now, about 1,000 people are hospitalized in and around El Paso as a result of COVID-19. As you mentioned, those hospitals, they are at capacity. That includes ICU beds. Patients are now being flown to neighboring cities here, and the convention center here in El Paso has been turned into a temporary hospital, able to house anywhere from 50 to 70 patients. All that said, Allison, the county judge here who issued that shutdown tells me that that is going to be just a drop in the bucket as to what this community may need in the weeks ahead if these COVID numbers keep going up. Allison?
Morgan, voter turnout in Texas has been massive. What are voters there telling you? What is driving Texans to the polls right now?
Well, no matter where you look in this state, Allison, we're seeing records being broken. Early voting in particular, more people voting in the early voting than in the entire 2016 election for this state. In El Paso, those records also ring true. This will have been the most heavily voted election in El Paso County's history. What's interesting to note here is that we saw those early voting numbers surge all across the state. Right now, the numbers are projected to have 40,000 votes cast or slightly above that here on actual election day. That will still be a record number in and of itself, but the chair of the Democratic Party here in El Paso County tells me that they really needed their goal to hit a higher number, anywhere from 75,000 votes cast for them to feel like they actually had a chance of turning Texas blue. We still have a couple hours left in the polls here. We're actually mountain time here in El Paso, the rest of the state in central time. So this is going to be the last county polls to close here. And that's why we're seeing volunteers, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke working at a phone bank, trying to make sure that they can drive the vote out here on that side of things. This is a primarily Democratic county, at least in recent history. And so that said, they're still trying to do whatever they can to drive that vote out here in Texas, being that reliably Republican state, as it has been since 1976.
Yeah, and Morgan, as you said, still some hours for voters to get out there. You mentioned what you heard from the Democratic National Committee. How about what you're hearing from the campaigns there, Trump campaign, the Biden campaign, about their hopes for Texas?
It's going to be very tight, and we knew that going in. The polls had both sides neck and neck. I've spoken to those on both sides. They say that Harris County, of course, had that huge surge in numbers there, but they're really pointing to those votes coming from rural communities. It'll take a little bit longer for those to come in, but Republicans are confident that, at least as of right now, they think they can still hold on to Texas. Allison?
All right, Morgan Chesky, thanks so much. 80 American and international scholars on authoritarianism have issued an open letter warning the future of American democracy is at stake. And for the first time, the Carter Center, founded by former President Jimmy Carter, has observed 111 elections in 40 countries. Now the center's unofficially monitoring the U.S. election. NBC News foreign correspondent Richard Engel looks at the global focus on the outcome of this election.
Allison, around the world, people and governments are watching this process immensely closely because it is consequential, because it matters for the future of alliances with the United States, because it matters potentially for the future of democracy around the world. And that's not an overstatement, but it is a big one. For the first time ever, international election observers are now training their attention to the United States. These are the kind of election observers you normally see in African countries or Caribbean countries where democracy is fragile, is new, and is often challenged by authoritarian leaders. And one of those groups that is monitoring the election unofficially is the Carter Center, set up by former President Jimmy Carter, which has monitored elections all over the world. And now they are focusing on the United States. I spoke to the head of the Carter Center and I asked him, why now? Why are you set up to look at democracy around the world where it is threatened, focusing on the U.S.?
I think we see a lot of issues in the United States. Extreme polarization among the political parties, real barriers to engage in the political process. We've seen the public discourse in many ways deteriorate. Threats of violence, perhaps. A lot of those issues are the things we see in other countries. And we just have to make sure, the United States, that we are paying attention, that we are maintaining our faith in our institutions.
This is the first time you are weighing in on an American election.
This is the first time we've ever weighed in on an American election as the Carter Center, because this moment is one that presents so many issues that we have seen over our decades of election observation that allow us to provide some credibility and, frankly, some perspective for both sides in a nonpartisan way about what's important in an election.
But there are not just concerns about the modalities of the U.S. election. There's real concern about the outcome, that if President Trump is elected for another 4-year term, alliances as we know them might not survive. That NATO, which has been the backbone for Western security since it was founded after World War II, might not be around if President Trump continues in office. He has been a fierce critic of NATO. Then you have America's adversaries, Russia and China. Right now, we are living in a world where the United States is the lone remaining superpower, something that China absolutely wants to challenge. And there are many Chinese officials who've been saying that even though President Trump has been tough on China with tariffs and lots of verbal attacks, that the division that has...
Lester Holt picks up our special election coverage right here on NBC News Now.
Everyone, we are seeing our first race results of the night. Georgia and South Carolina, they're right now too early to call. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to NBC News Election Headquarters. Live coverage of Election Night 2020. It is finally here.
Yeah, polls are already closing around the country. Here's what we're going to be watching tonight. First, it's the fight between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, of course, for those crucial battleground states that will decide this election, including Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
We're tracking each candidate's road to 270 electoral votes. That's the number, of course, needed to win the presidency.
There's another big story tonight. Who will control the United States Senate? A handful of races will determine that question, and we're watching them all.
So polls have just closed in 6 states with 60 electoral votes. Let's get right to it. And you see right now, Georgia is too early to call.
Let's go to South Carolina. There's a big Senate race as well as the presidential. Too early to call. We're waiting for vote there. In Indiana, we can make this call, and it's an expected one. The president will easily carry Indiana, the home state of Vice President Mike Pence. And let's look at Virginia. It is too early to call. However, our projection is that it is a Biden lead at this hour.
All right, let's take a look at Kentucky. And Kentucky right now, too early to call. But you see the first numbers we're getting of the night. Vermont is too early to call. And let's look at how all this takes us on that road to 270 right now. And you can see Donald Trump with 11 electoral votes to Biden 0.
Well, it could be a long night, and this is going to be an election like no other. We've got Andrea Mitchell here with us. We have Chuck Todd here with us. And one thing that's different is the enormous amount of mail-in voting. 100 million people have already voted before today. So we wanted to just break down, when you see expected vote in the top right-hand corner of our graphics, that includes mail-in voting. It's not just day of voting, but includes mail-in voting as well.
Yeah, we're not looking at just precincts. That's the term you're not going to hear a lot of tonight. It's this expected vote, which is an educated estimate. It may change a bit here or there, but it'll be the thing to watch tonight as we get that road.
It is, and look, I'm just going to show you real quick how you'll be able to follow it, and we'll show you real fast here and take a look at one of our states right now. Here, hopefully we are starting to get here. We should be able to see it here in Indiana. And not yet here. Well, we will work on that. The data is coming in here any second now. We'll go here and let's see if it's working. There we go. Right here, we're going to be able to tell you, and you'll see this on all of our state results all night long. We'll tell you, in Indiana, we knew there were 207,000 early and absentee votes, and see this orange line. You'll see this as the night, and we'll see some states you're going to see the early and absentee take up most of that column. Then your election day vote's going to come in at yellow there, and you'll start to see the yellow. A place like Pennsylvania, we expect more yellow than we will orange. And then this gray spot. Look, I want to tell people something. This number, it's an estimate. It is an estimate. It could change throughout the night. We may learn more. Oh, there's more ballots than we thought, or there's fewer ballots than we thought. But this is the expected vote as best as we can estimate it before the election. So this could move by anywhere from a percentage point or two. But this is what we'll be letting you know about all night long.
The main thing is we are counting early vote, and we are estimating day of vote when we talk about how much of the vote is in it.
We'll revisit this along the way.
All night long, because people are going to want to know how much did the early vote impact this election as well?
All right, Andrea Mitchell is here. What are some of your early thoughts?
Well, early thoughts include what's going to happen in Pennsylvania, and that's a place where suburban women did not turn out for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And what we might see this year, and it just depends on whether that gender gap shows that we've seen all along in the early polling between Joe Biden and Donald Trump for weeks now. Women are disproportionately affected by COVID, and the suburban white women have really been going for Joe Biden over Donald Trump in the polling straight through. If that holds, that could be key in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and other states. It could offset Donald Trump's big advantage with white, non-college educated men. And these women are staying at home, many working from home, taking care of children. They're disproportionately affected by COVID, and they're telling us, at least in the polling up until now, that they don't like the way the president has handled the pandemic. And they don't like some of his language.
All right, Andrew, we have got a tremendous team of correspondents spread out across the country, analyzing results in the key states. We'll check in with them tonight. But first, a look at where the candidates are tracking tonight's outcome.
So let's start with Hallie Jackson. She's at the White House. That's where the president is watching results come in. Kristen Welker is at Joe Biden's headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. But Hallie, we'll start with you. What's the mood inside Trump team?
The president is here at the White House watching these returns come in, mixing yet again his official position here with campaign activities. An event set to be held in the East Room tonight. Several hundred supporters of the president will be here watching this all unfold. We are told by sources close to the president that he is sounding tired. You can hear it in his voice a little bit. It's raspy from all those rallies he's been holding the last couple of days. But in conversations, he is indicating that he is feeling good, feeling optimistic about his chances. So let's talk about what we're hearing from allies and aides close to the president in this campaign. They're specifically looking at some key battlegrounds, and they're feeling encouraged about states like Florida, Ohio, Iowa, some of the states that had been on that battleground map, Arizona. They're feeling optimistic about Georgia and North Carolina. There's a big question mark on Michigan. I think that many acknowledge that that is, privately, they'll say, an uphill climb for President Trump at this point, critical when it comes to the electoral vote there. And then there's a really interesting state, Pennsylvania. I asked one person close to the president which 3 states they're going to be looking at tonight, right now. And they said, well, Pennsylvania, and then Pennsylvania, and after that, Pennsylvania again. This is a state where the president has campaigned more than any other throughout this 2020 cycle. There is a lot at stake here because it could potentially be a tipping point. The president has acknowledged that very publicly, but here the race, the polls show that it is extremely close. So a lot of eyeballs on Pennsylvania tonight. As far as the mood more broadly, listen, I covered this campaign back in 2016 when it was a come-from-behind win. I vividly remember election night with all of you that night as well. And there is the memory of that is still lingering, the sense that this campaign has been an underdog before and could be an underdog and pull out another victory again. But there are also those close to the president who are looking at the way suburban women, for example, seniors have moved away from the president, largely because of questions about his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And that, I think, has given some folks pause tonight, Savannah.
All right, Hallie leading us off at the White House. Thank you.
And Kristen Welker is at Biden headquarters in Delaware. Kristen, what's the mood there? What's the story there?
Well, Joe Biden watching returns with his family here in Delaware after striking a confident note throughout the day and after making some final campaign stops. He was in Pennsylvania, Scranton, where, of course, he was born, visiting his childhood home. He was also in Philadelphia, urging them to get out the vote. Why so much focus on Pennsylvania? Biden has been there several times over the past several days. Well, because the Biden campaign says, look, they don't need Pennsylvania in order to win the White House. However, it is very difficult for President Trump to win re-election if he doesn't carry Pennsylvania. Of course, that's a state that he won back in 2016. So that's why you see this intense focus on the Keystone State. They like what they're hearing so far in terms of the turnout rate, so they are watching that very closely. But they're also, of course, watching the Midwest, that blue wall that did not hold for Hillary Clinton. Biden has been there multiple times. Michigan, Wisconsin, urging people to get out and vote for him. He says to vote for change. So they will be watching quite closely. They say they don't need to win states like Florida and North Carolina, but those states could help Biden with a victory. So there is measured optimism here inside the Biden camp. Now, some Democrats privately expressing concerns that Biden hasn't had the same aggressive campaign schedule that we have seen from President Trump. I asked a campaign official about that today. This official said, look, we feel confident. We feel as though we left it all out on the field. So now they are watching and waiting with the rest of the country.
All right, Kristen Welker, thank you.
As mentioned, there is a big battle over the United States Senate. Democrats need to pick up a net of 3 seats if they win the White House, or 4 if they don't. And here are some results. Too early to call, but this is a hot race in South Carolina between Lindsey Graham, the longtime senator, and Jamie Harrison. In Georgia, we got a couple of races tonight. This one also too early to call. John Ossoff, the Democrat, David Perdue, the Republican. Now we've got what they call a jungle primary. That's the technical term. Everybody's in it, and not just these 3. It's too early to call, but both of those Georgia's races could go to a runoff if no candidate gets to 50% in January.
Yeah. All right, let's look at the Kentucky Senate race, 14% in. Too early to call. Mitch McConnell up against Amy McGrath. In Virginia, too early to call. And let's see where that leaves the Senate right now. Need a drum roll with this. Democrats with 35 seats, 30 for the Republicans.
Yeah, we haven't called any yet, but we've got Casey Hunt right here in New York with us. She's watching the Senate very closely. Casey, what are the big races you got your eye on tonight?
Well, you guys just walked through some of them, and I would describe it broadly, Savannah, as the Sun Belt suburbs. So what does that mean? We've talked a little bit already about Georgia, the suburbs of Atlanta, the place that really could not just be a demographic shift that we've been talking about for several election cycles, but be a place that could really turn against President Trump. And that not only has huge implications for the presidential ticket, it also has implications for there are 2 Senate races, as we have walked through. One of them, Senator Perdue, a Republican, he's an incumbent. He's running against John Ossoff. If John Ossoff can get to 50% tonight, that's going to be a sign that Democrats are in for a very good night. Obviously, far too early to call that at this point, but that's what I'm going to be watching all through the night. That logic also applies to these other Sunbelt suburbs. Phoenix, Arizona is another one. Martha McSally running against Mark Kelly, who's a Democratic challenger. Many Republicans think that that race may already be gone for Martha McSally, the incumbent, and if that's the case, it's all about those suburbs of Phoenix. And then the big surprise, of course, tonight, Savannah, potentially in Texas. We don't always think about Texas as being driven by suburbs, but it really is. Houston, Dallas area places. There is a Senate race in Texas. John Cornyn, the Republican senator, is an incumbent there. We have expected him to do better than President Trump in Texas. It's one of actually only a few places where you have a Republican senator who's running ahead of the president. So some people, some Republicans I'm talking to who are pessimistic about Texas suggest that John Cornyn could hold on, but perhaps President Trump could have a rough night there in Texas. Obviously, of course, far too early to say with any certainty about how these are going so far, but those are the places that I think are really going to determine control of the Senate through the night.
Well, everything's bigger in Texas, Casey, including the turnout that we've seen so far of the roughly 10 million votes, which is about 10% of all the early votes that have been cast so far.
All right, Chuck, a lot of folks watching tonight. Are we going to get an answer tonight? What's the road? How do we get there?
Well, by the way, watch the Texas turnout. If it's 17 million, that's what Democrats tell me they would need to actually pull that off. So watch that tonight. Well, I'm going to take you through our sort of how to watch tonight a little bit and this idea, what are we going to know and what aren't we going to know? Look, at the end of the day, we know that these 3 states are not going to be reporting tonight, at least. There's a chance Wisconsin could get a bunch of vote in before the Today Show, which is always my measurement here, before the Today Show. Right. Michigan and Pennsylvania, very unlikely. So let's, how do you want to watch the night? Well, we know we're going to see these early states here first, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And let me just show you why they're so important to President Trump and why he really probably has to sweep the Sun Belt. Because if you go back and give the Clinton states here to Biden in our battleground map, and you go ahead and give Trump his states of Iowa and Ohio here, we're going to leave these 3 unchecked here. We'll go ahead and put that there, and we're going to go ahead and put Maine in blue here for now. And we're going to we have the ability to do this, split the Maine control, if you will. And we're going to go ahead and give Nebraska here for now, put it in the Biden column. So you can see everything we can do. And then here's the situation, though. If the president doesn't win these Sunbelt states, and any of them, if he doesn't win these Sunbelt states, and they're right now, we're going to put him in red like he did the last time. But if he just loses, as you can see here, if he just loses, if he doesn't get Florida, he doesn't get close, you've got Arizona, which would be a problem. If that gets him there, If Wisconsin and Michigan end up blue, and they lean blue right now, you start to see where just one of these Sunbelt states starts to do it, and if he gets a second, then suddenly Pennsylvania no longer is here. But for the president, if he is able to hang on, and he hangs on, then look what we're staring at. We are staring at a one-state contest where we're all going to be wondering what Pennsylvania's about.
What are the early clues?
The early clues are going to be, to me, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Arizona. One flip by Biden there, and suddenly the president's path gets really complicated. Two flips, and we have an idea of who the next president's going to be.
All right, Chuck, we'll be watching. Those Sunbelt states are better at voting early and counting early, so we'll see. It might decide how long this night really is. We're going to take a quick break right here. Much more ahead. The latest results when we continue with Election Night 2020 in just a moment.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend. These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Welcome back to Election Night 2020 on NBC News.
We've got some numbers coming in. Let's look at the Virginia presidential race. And right now, that's too early, but we can report that Biden is leading in Virginia.
Let's look at Georgia. It's a swing state this year. We don't usually say that. It's too early to call, but we're starting to get a few votes in. Let's go to South Carolina. Too early to call there as well.
In Vermont, we can project that Joe Biden is the winner in Vermont.
Yeah, that's a new call. Yeah, well, we just got that in. Yeah, but not a surprise, but yes. Okay, let's go to Rahima Ellis. She's in Philly, where, of course, the Democrats are really hoping on a high turnout to kind of break out what happens in other more rural parts of this state. Rahima, what are you seeing?
What we're seeing here, Savannah, is that right now in this Philadelphia area that we're in, the voting has been quiet because it was very heavy in days leading up to this. They got a lot of mail-in ballots that were brought into the state. As you know, so many people went out and online, stood in line in order to cast their ballots early. When we talked to people, we found out that one of the things that they were really concerned about here was COVID-19, which is one of the reasons why so many people mailed in their ballots. For the first time, they had over 400,000 mail-in ballots requested for this election, a presidential election, and they received more than 330,000 before this election day began. So that's why they think that they didn't have very long lines here. But in other counts of the parts of the state, they did have long lines. One of the things that's really important here is that they tell us that it is not likely they're going to be able to call this race for either candidate tonight because the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania says they're going to count all of those mail-in ballots. And if they are properly postmarked tonight by 8 o'clock, they will be counted even up till Friday. Savannah?
All right, Rahima, thank you. And Chuck, you've been looking at those exit polls. What do you see in your tea leaves over there?
Well, we want to show you, look, a lot of the strength here, and I'm going to bring up we have some Georgia exit poll numbers among white voters here. And this is a key. When Democrats do well in southern states, they have to essentially perform better with some white voters. They have to get to the 30% mark. Here's what's interesting in Georgia. The last time, and you can see it here, the last time a Democrat carried Georgia was in 1992. It was Bill Clinton, which is also the last time that any Democrat got more than 30% of the white vote. Right now, Joe Biden is sitting at exactly 30% of the white vote. You can see 2004, 2016. So the last time it's been there, it's a magic number to watch there, that 30% mark. That is usually what Democrats need in Georgia, assuming they have the African-American turnout they need. And right now in Georgia, it looks like it. That is why right now Democrats are so bullish on Georgia.
And real quickly, until we have vote, we're talking exit polls. Those exit polls are including day of vote and also surveys conducted of early voters.
It is, and look, and we've seen this before. The exit polls can, overstate by a point or two. We were able to, as we see real returns come in, we match it. We're able to reweight it. There's always a chance that it's at 2 points. But the point is this: winning candidates, winning Democrats in states like Georgia get 30% of the white vote. Exit is saying that. Let's see what the real returns say.
All right, Chuck, thank you. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more NBC News Decision 2020 election night coverage in just a moment.
By mail,
early in person, or on election day.
Each state has its own set of rules for the way we cast our ballots.
Yes, it's a little confusing. That's why we have to figure it out now.
Take 15 minutes and plan your vote.
ASAP. In some places, the polls are already open. Go! Make sure your voice is heard.
Plan your vote. Plan your vote.
Plan your vote.
Washington feels more chaotic than ever. It's my job to ask the tough questions, left and right, and help you make sense of it all.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
Welcome back. At bottom of the hour, we're going to get a poll closing in North Carolina. That's a biggie.
Yeah, 7:30 Eastern is when we should be getting that poll closing for North Carolina. This is the state that the Democratic governor ran afoul, of course, of the president over the Republican National Convention and COVID.
Yeah, and it's a Senate battleground, it's a presidential battleground, and it could tell the whole story tonight if we get a result.
And what we see very clearly from the exit polls, at least so far, is that there's a real split, a racial divide on what is the issue most important to the voters. For black voters, 48% say it's racial inequality. For white voters, 46% say it is the economy. They're exactly reversed.
North Carolina, by the way, is one of those states. There's not a lot of swing areas. It is margins. You're gonna hear that a lot from me.
Explain that. That's Chuck's speak. You got to run up.
That's right. This isn't a county that vacillates between red and blue. These counties are big blue counties or big red counties. Red in the rural areas, blue in the urban areas. It's about running up the score, and each side is trying to run that up. In these key Sunbelt states, there's a lot more of that, particularly Georgia and North Carolina. So these are what we call margin states. So it's all about how much do you run up the score for Democrats in Charlotte, how much in the rural areas for Trump.
And they count the votes pretty quickly.
It's a fairly quick process, but it is a tight race.
All right. Yeah. We will be right back with more coverage after this.
To Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you, whether you're back to school.
What do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work. We're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend. These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story.
The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The winds fanning these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. We're going to get some key poll closings in a couple of minutes, including the all-important state of North Carolina, of Ohio, and West Virginia. That's just moments away, but we've already gotten some polls closed tonight, Georgia being one of them. This is a battleground this year. It's too early to call at this hour.
And Kentucky, South Carolina also too early to call right now, the race for president.
But let's look at what's happening in the race for president in Virginia. We are calling it too early to call. That's South Carolina. Here's Virginia. So we will continue to watch that. And let's talk about North Carolina. Chuck, I mean, this is going to be one of those states that might really tell the whole story tonight.
It is, and one of the big things is going to be, I think, African-American turnout. You know, if 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton lost the race by about 3 points, 49-46 after rounding. And when Barack Obama won it in 2008, he just had a bigger share of African-American voters. So the real question is going to be, did Joe Biden get an African-American turnout that looks more like the Obama-Biden?
Here's the numbers just came in from North Carolina. This is what we have right now. Too early to call, but our first numbers as the polls close in North Carolina. Ohio, too early to call as well.
We've got West Virginia closing as well. It's too early to call, but we've got the president in the lead as expected. So where does it shake out on that map? To 270 electoral votes. That's what's required to take the presidency, and we are still early in this night. Joe Biden getting 3 so far. Donald Trump with Indiana at 11.
Yeah, long road to 270, but certainly we've been watching Ohio. Joe Biden, late in the game, decided to put Ohio on his expanded map, so we'll see.
Look, the place to watch Ohio is going to be around Lake Erie. Those Lake counties, those are all used to be some Union Democrats. Donald Trump did really well, basically from Toledo on one end all the way through. Sherrod Brown, when he won his re-election in 2018, got a bunch of those counties back. That's what we're going to be watching for tonight. Is Joe Biden looking like a Sherrod Brown Democrat, or is he going to look like a Hillary Clinton Democrat in Ohio?
And let me go to Casey Hunt on this, because Erie, Pennsylvania is one of those areas the president went to for a rally, but actually said, I believe, to the Erie voters, I didn't think I'd have to come here. I didn't think I'd have to push it so hard. But every vote in Pennsylvania is being fought for.
That's right, Savannah. In fact, he said, I didn't want to have to come here. I didn't want to have to, as you say, fight for it, which is not necessarily a traditional message from any political candidate to a group of people where you're standing there and you're asking for their votes. And Pennsylvania, of course, Joe Biden's original home state, his hometown of Scranton there, his boyhood home. And it has been a place where both candidates have visited over and over and over again. And to Chuck's point about that area along Lake Erie, you know, that also, I think, speaks to questions about whether Joe Biden can actually increase his support among white voters. Democrats have been losing support generally among white voters, and we've, you know, covered extensively all of those people, those blue-collar folks who maybe voted for Obama twice and then flipped and voted for Donald Trump. And could Joe Biden stem the bleeding there? And our exit polls are showing some early signs that it's possible that that's the case in places like Georgia as well. Now, that, of course, could also be suburban, and don't forget that the suburbs in states like Ohio and especially in Pennsylvania are also very important here, and that extends our conversation to suburban.